things from the standpoint of FDA. As we think about trials here, we're looking to have evidence that helps us get things off to a good start, which means that although we are not responsible for deployment of vaccines, we can help generate the evidence that will get them off to a good start, which means trial designs can potentially incorporate looking at the effect of a vaccine on transmission. We know that for certain infectious diseases, vaccines do a very good job at, or did a good job at preventing transmission, which a good example of that was the older pertussis vaccine, great example of a vaccine which both prevented disease and prevented the transmission of the infectious agent. We know that, for instance, the first generation COVID-19 vaccines did not do a terrible job. They had 40–50% reduction in transmission, but subsequently that fell off practically to zero. Or close to it. So we do have, this desire to try to have a combination of ideally of direct benefit and indirect benefit baked into the vaccines. It's just that it's so much more expensive often to get the data that one needs when one's developing a vaccine about the prevention of transmission. That's because when you're developing a vaccine, it's much easier to look at individual surrogates of protection or correlates of protection, such as antibody levels in an individual or the prevention of disease in a given individual than in household contexts, et cetera. When this was suggested, for instance, during COVID-19, that a study be done that would look at formally look at the interruption of transmission, the cost became just insurmountable. And so unless you had a particular population that you could use that was at risk, for instance, college students or those in a military population in a given closed location, it's very hard to imagine that. But I think as we move forward, we need to think about generating this kind of evidence, because we are going to need compelling evidence to help people feel convinced that vaccination is good for themselves, but also for their communities. And having that kind of information may be helpful. I just want to also just back up and say that by definition, when we're developing vaccines for broad use, one of their direct benefits has to be that they are very safe medical products, okay? That just goes without saying, because that goes to getting acceptance of people both for their individual direct benefit as well as potentially for the indirect benefit, right? If you have an intervention that you can do that provides you with a good degree of safety personally, but then it can help others, you'll tend to do it. We hope that's why people wear seatbelts, et cetera. Right, because things like that, where there's the cost of this in terms of potential adverse effects is very low. We by design make sure that's the case with any vaccines that are approved, and I think that's also one of the issues that factors into this whole equation of whether you have individual benefit as well as societal benefit from the vaccines that we deploy. At the end of the day, I think the case here is a really interesting one, because when you look at the cost of deploying a vaccine, if you can interrupt transmission, you get even more cost benefit from it, right? And that's why the effectiveness of measles vaccine when you have a high rate of measles vaccination. In other words, measles vaccine with measles vaccination rates over 95% is an incredibly cost-effective. It's usually rated among, this is public health when it gets to its best, right? Low-cost medical product given twice early in life when you have at high coverage rates. Leads to the abrogation of a potentially deadly disease. That's a good thing, right? That kills at a rate of about 1 in 1,000. This is, I think how we have to be thinking here. Highly safe medical products deployed, and how we generate the evidence, though, going forward is going to be critical because I heard this earlier on loud and clear, and I have now experienced it. Vaccine mandates are not going to get us there, right? It's going to be compelling evidence. And it's going to be compelling evidence both for vaccine effectiveness for the individual and potentially for the community, as well as compelling evidence that the vaccines are safe for the individual.
Well, I really appreciate your comments. We're going to come back to how we get this evidence better and how to communicate about that. But I mentioned before the RSV vaccine. So, and Blythe in the previous panel said, what about a product that might have very limited benefits for an individual? Every product has risk, as you mentioned. Vaccines are extensively tested in huge populations, and we'll come back later to the, to the post-market evidence systems that are continuing to get better and better too. But every product has, some small risk associated with it, very well defined. What about these products like the RSV vaccine? It's not going to do much for the mom, very low risk of complications from RSV, but it could do a lot for the neonate. I know you weren't directly involved in that decision, but you provide any context for how FDA thinks about that kind of case where there could be significant indirect benefits from a product use, which goes to kind of the core of some of the issues we're talking about here today.
Yeah. I think, Mark, that goes directly back to this benefit risk calculation. If and you said it already, the risk is low enough to the mother, right? Low enough to the neonate. In other words, very low rate of that's why we were obsessed. There was an obsession about rates of miscarriage or anything that could be that could upset the risk calculus. But otherwise, to have something that is a relatively easy intervention, right, that doesn't involve having to give a newborn an infusion of something, an injection or infusion, quite a nice thing to be able to have, right? Whether it be for Tdap or RSV, things that can provide a neonate with protection against something that's life-threatening. And somehow we've seemed to have missed that. In the olden days, there was like life years that we used to calculate often, right? Saved. If you save a 6-month-old from death, you've got a lot of life years that you've added, right? And so I think we need to this concept of, well, there are only a couple of deaths that occur from COVID or a couple of deaths from influenza. You've been watching children, and having interacted with families that have lost children to infectious diseases. It breaks the whole family. So yeah. I think we need to be thinking, not that it's any better for an older family, older person, but I do think we need to think about this. And the way we get there, Mark, is I think we set that risk tolerance as very, risk averse. It means we demand a lot of our vaccine candidates. I feel
a lot of that direct evidence that we're talking about that's already built into the clinical trials for getting to approval. Yeah.
Yeah. And it does mean that sometimes we're going to kick out candidates that if they're not safe enough. Now, remember that this risk calculus shifts, right? So if suddenly somehow, we had, I'm just going to make up a hypothetical, the Ebola Kansas strain suddenly, sorry, didn't mean to pick on any place, but
no news here.
And there was a 25% mortality, and you had a vaccine that caused you
Mhm.
know, caused
Yeah.
an incidence of GBS or something of one in 10,000 or one in 100,000, you'd say, nope, sorry, we're going to deploy, right? We'd
Mhm.
shift that risk calculus based on the threat. But and this has to be, this risk calculus is something that also seems to get lost, because what has happened is for vaccines, we are continually focusing now only on adverse events and not on benefits. And I think that's because of the success we've had with vaccines.
Yeah.
Measles vaccine is an incredible victim of its success. But if you want to see what happens when you don't have measles vaccine, you don't have to go very far. Just take a trip to Africa and Asia, and you can see what happens when you don't have
Yeah.
measles vaccine. You
Yeah.
have
And we're going to come back to
129,000 deaths in a year.
and we're going to come back to some of the real world evidence, even here in the U.S., that's relevant to questions like that.
Ready.
So maybe we could talk a little bit about what you all see as the systems that are out there now, for you developing post market evidence, and how we can build on those to make it easier and simpler as new products come along to extend the kinds of studies that are feasible in the pre-market setting, to post-market. Peter, I might start with you. You talked about how doing sort of a direct effect of changes in transmissibility associated with COVID vaccinations over time was prohibitively expensive and not feasible on a sort of like, kind of prospective randomized trial basis. But if you could maybe review for us, I talked about this briefly at the top, the systems that FDA supports now to understand benefits and risks of vaccines, other biologic products, is through BEST and through some other programs. Those got going. At least my brief summary would be they got going to be able to detect and follow up on adverse events that could be significant and could be related to the product, but that needed more systematic population level looks than you could get from just the adverse event reporting system alone, VAERS or the like. But those systems are also now being used to look at effectiveness issues. I think most of this is still focused on the individual direct benefits, but can you say something about how FDA's post-market real-world evidence systems are potentially going to be more useful for assessing indirect benefits?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Mark, and I think this goes to trying to make them even more robust than they are right now. Sentinel Best, depending on what time it is, depending on how many contracts we have let, we're dealing with between 60 million and 160 million lives, something in that magnitude. And those are really, if you can get enough coverage, particularly in a given area, right? I mean, even if you can't get all coverage across the country, if you can at least saturate certain areas, both between a combination of what we can get for private insurers as well as public payers, Medicare, Medicaid, you potentially could do the kind of real world evidence studies that you need. Why? Because if you have a catchment area that's large enough and you're capturing all the hospitalizations in a given area, and that's your endpoint, one of the endpoints you're interested in, for instance, it could be hospitalizations because of a respiratory virus, you probably could get some idea of indirect benefit, because you might be able to understand in almost like a wedge design or a case control design, areas where you have high levels of vaccination and areas where you have lower levels of vaccination, and you'll know the vaccination status of those who are hospitalized or not hospitalized. So, I think there's probably ways to get to get there. And again, perfect may be the enemy of good. We may not need to have 340 million people under the system. We may need to just get to some representative places where we get to reasonably good coverage. But we know we know from data that have been done with the CMS database that we can do vaccine effectiveness studies using claims-based data. It's really nice when we get access to the EHR as well. Again, when I say we get access, we don't actually look at the data. Our partner looks at the data. So the confidentiality is maintained. But we know for high-dose influenza vaccine, the effectiveness was documented similar to the effectiveness in a randomized controlled clinical trial through a real-world evidence study using the CMS database, and it was remarkably similar. So I think a lot of confidence that if we have the systems in place, we could potentially get some of these data. And what we will lose in terms of some of the fineness of endpoints like viral loads, et cetera, we may gain in just larger outcomes, which some payers might feel like more confident
They
of,
care
right?
more about anyway.
If you're
Yeah, from
costing
a
me
payer
less because you have fewer
standpoint.
people in the hospital, that's probably a good thing, right?
Yeah, we did have one question just to stick with you for one more minute that came up in the first session. I was holding it for this one around the data quality issues in these real world systems. So, my sense is that they have advantages and disadvantages. Claims, we've seen a lot of news lately about how sometimes the diagnosis information there isn't right, but they're pretty good for things like whether or not a person went to the emergency room with complication from a respiratory condition or was hospitalized or something like that. On the electronic record side, that potentially would have richer data, as you were noting, Peter, about risk factors of the individual, things that we get at Susan's questions about, if we're targeting a product for certain settings that were higher risk and the like. What's your sense about the state of EHR data quality for the kinds of questions would be relevant to understanding indirect benefits?
So here, this is a really great question, right? You have to know what questions you're asking for. And you also then, once you do that, you need to spot check. And we do check and essentially audit to make sure we're getting, a sense of reality. Certain things are probably correct when you get them from the EHR. Did you get vaccinated? Did you not? Why? Because you can get the NDC, you can get the codes. You basically can confirm that you've got things right, probably. You can confirm hospitalization dates. You can confirm certain resource utilization. You can confirm whether someone was intubated or not intubated, again, because you've got things like this. And we can check those things. On the other hand, there are certain things that are not fit for purpose currently because doctors just don't record them well in the EHR even. Like, was a vaccine associated with reduction in headache, because certain things are so common and doctors are so bad at recording them, you couldn't, actually rely on what was in the medical record to say that it was or was not present. I mean, that's a bad example maybe, but you get the drift. Things that are not necessarily as cut and dry. Lab values often very good to be able to pull from the EHR, whereas subjective symptoms much more challenging, not because necessarily of a glitch in the computer system, because of a glitch in us as humans. Either it's not recorded in the EHR, or if it's recorded, there's a lot of variability in how people judge what a severe headache is. So I think this is it is in general, if you are looking for things that matter, or that will make a difference to payers, I think most of those endpoints are ones that we probably can get a reasonably look at, and we routinely audit to make sure that we're not like missing something as terribly miscategorized in the system.
It is more standardized electronic health data become available. CMS has some case reporting requirements now, and the burden of collecting those can be made as low as possible through kind of automated capture from electronic records. That doesn't capture everyone in a community, but to Peter's point, if there's enough participation in a program in a community, a state, or a health system, that may be a pathway forward as well. It does seem like it's easier for countries that have a sort of single health system, or in Israel, you know, there are three, but they do have good longitudinal data. I'm just wondering if any of you all have, maybe Peter, I'll go back to you, since you brought up this point about communities. I mean, it does seem like between CDC and efforts to do better electronically capture data from diagnostic tests that are performed, community-based surveillance resources like wastewater testing and the like, there could be there is maybe a better foundation for doing these kinds of studies at the community level. Are there steps that you think would be effective for on the public side, or maybe especially the private side, working together to create more of a platform like Natalie was talking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there is clearly some role for advanced planning here. And I think this goes to the concept of why it really is worth thinking about. Like, I don't know, we shouldn't like have like magical thinking. The magical thinking that we had our 1 in 100 years pandemic, and we're not going to see any infectious diseases for the next 100 years. That's magical thinking. We don't need that. We probably do need to be prepared for the next time we have an infectious outbreak that's pretty widespread. And one of the things that I think you're spot on, we could do is think about how we could construct somewhat, although they're a little bit artificial, we have a, because we're going to naturally have differences across the country in uptake of vaccines, we may have the ability to look in a randomized manner if we have the right way to measure infectious spread, be it wastewater or other metrics in a given area. That, combined with understanding the vaccine coverage in those areas, could allow us to get at some of these questions in a much more efficient manner, and in a way that's almost incidental to data we're going to obtain anyway, right? So it's not like some big incremental cost. The COVID study that was going to be done was going to involve like going to a college and doing nasal swabs on students like every other day. For 3 months, which was going to cost tens of millions of dollars. Here, you would be doing something that would be going on a regular. You'd be doing this as part of your surveillance anyway, potentially, and some of the data would be automatically captured from the vaccines that would be given. So I think you're right. If we did some planning in advance, we probably could bake some of this in, and it's one of those things that. You design it, you put it aside, and at some point you activate it when you need to. You probably want to freshen it every few years, but it's a pretty good chance that we're going to need to activate it at some
Thank you.
point.
Peter, any final thoughts?
Just want to say thank you. No, I think it's been these are really all interesting things to think about. I do think this is it is really we are fast approaching a time when we are going to have to understand individual and societal benefits of vaccination, and they do both. I know we have this incredible bent for the individual right now, but just like we have speed limits to prevent disasters on highways, right? We have mandatory safety belt use to prevent the cost of having people needing major trauma surgery when they get into massive accidents, to reduce that. Vaccines, I think we have to try to make the case here by a combination of showing how safe we can make them. We have to make them as safe as we possibly can, and trying to figure out ways to help people understand how much they can help those, once again, in their communities.
Yeah.
By gathering the evidence to show them what a difference it can make in their communities.